Hey guys, today we're going to spend some time in the medieval world, where survival wasn't just hard, it was often strange. Not strange in the way movies like to show, with constant battles and kings shouting orders, but strange in the quiet, everyday ways that could push whole regions to the edge. The medieval near extinctions weren't usually caused by one single disaster. They happened when small, ordinary vulnerabilities stacked up, and then the weather turned, the crops failed, or a sickness arrived at exactly the wrong moment. If you enjoy long, careful history that makes the past feel clearer and a little more human, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, and it's the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next deep dive. To understand how medieval people could almost go extinct, we have to set aside the modern assumption that a bad year is just a bad year. For much of the Middle Ages, a bad year could become a bad decade. Most people lived close to the line of subsistence. Food storage existed, but it was limited by technology, by pests, by damp, by politics, and by the simple fact that a family could not store what it never had. When harvests were normal, life was already a negotiation with hunger. When harvests failed, there was no cushion, only movement, bargaining, rationing, and, for many, a slow drift into weakness that made every other threat more dangerous. In that world, the bizarre part is not that catastrophe happened. The bizarre part is how many different pathways led to the same cliff edge. One of the simplest and most underestimated was weather. Medieval agriculture depended heavily on predictable seasons. A wet spring could rot seed in the ground. A cold summer could stunt grain. A storm at the wrong time could flatten fields just before harvest. This wasn't merely inconvenient. It was arithmetic. If a village needed, say, 3 parts grain to survive the year, 1 to eat, 1 to plant, 1 to pay rents and taxes, then a harvest cut in half didn't mean everyone ate half as much. It meant the system broke. People ate seed grain that should have been planted. They sold tools, animals, and clothing to buy food. They migrated, spreading pressure and disease along roads and into towns. And once the seed grain was gone, the next year's harvest was threatened even if the weather improved. That's how a climate wobble became a demographic crisis. Not a single blow, but a chain reaction. The great medieval famine of the early 14th century is a clear example of how quickly the chain could tighten. A run of unusually wet, cold years reduced yields across large parts of northern Europe. Grain didn't ripen properly. Hay for animals became scarce, so livestock weakened, died, or were slaughtered early, removing a vital backup source of calories and traction. In a world where oxen pulled plows and manure restored fields, losing animals wasn't just losing meat, it was losing the engine of agriculture. Famine also reshaped behavior in ways that made recovery harder. People mixed inferior grains, stretched flour with whatever they could grind, and ate foods that were normally emergency rations. Malnutrition reduced resistance to infection. Communities argued over access to mills, ovens, and pasture. Authorities sometimes tried price controls or emergency imports, but transport was slow and often expensive, and hoarding could be as dangerous as the original shortage. When medieval people almost went extinct, it often began with something as unglamorous as damp. Another bizarre pathway was the hidden chemistry of food itself. Medieval diets leaned heavily on grain, especially for the poor. Bread, ale, porridge, grain was daily life. That dependence created a vulnerability that modern people can overlook. If the grain was compromised, a whole population could be compromised with it. Mold and fungal contamination weren't fully understood, and they didn't always announce themselves dramatically. A harvest gathered in wet conditions could develop toxins in storage. In some regions and years, rye could be affected by ergot, a fungus that produces compounds capable of causing severe illness. Medieval people didn't have the language to separate bad bread from divine punishment or mysterious plague. They only saw that after a certain batch of food, people became weak, confused, or physically impaired, and that the harm seemed to spread through households that shared the same loaf. Even when communities suspected the food, they might still eat it, because hunger can make a risk feel like a gamble worth taking. Then there was the medieval relationship with water, which was both a lifeline and a hazard. Towns and villages clustered around rivers and wells. Water carried trade and powered mills, but it also carried waste. The Middle Ages had sophisticated habits in some places: cisterns, conduits, rules about latrines. Yet in many communities, especially as towns grew quickly, contamination was a constant threat. Gastrointestinal disease doesn't need drama to be deadly in a malnourished population. Dehydration and weakness, especially in children, can turn a seasonal outbreak into a sustained decline. And even when the illness itself was not fatal, it reduced the labor force at exactly the moment people needed to work harder, bringing in whatever crops survived, repairing buildings after storms, or simply traveling to find food. A medieval crisis often deepened because sickness didn't just kill. It interrupted the work that might have prevented the next shortage. Of course, we can't talk about medieval populations pushed toward collapse without the great accelerant. Epidemic disease moving along the same routes that carried grain, cloth, salt, and people. When the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century, it didn't enter a stable world. It entered a society already stressed by famine, economic tension, and the limits of medieval medicine. The result was not only a sharp decline in population, but a shock to institutions and expectations. Fields went unplanted because there weren't enough hands. Rents and wages shifted. In some places, social order tightened. In others, it loosened. And while the disease's most famous wave is the one people remember, the medieval experience included recurring outbreaks over generations. That meant the population didn't simply rebound and move on. It lived with a new, unsettling rhythm, periods of rebuilding interrupted by sudden loss. If almost extinct sounds like exaggeration, consider what it meant to watch entire neighborhoods empty, to see skilled trades vanish, to lose the elderly who held memory and practice, and to realize that normal life could be erased in a season. Yet, the medieval near extinctions weren't only biological. They were also political and logistical. One of the strangest truths of the period is that people could starve in a land that still contained food. Medieval markets were not always efficient. Roads could be impassable in winter or after floods. Local lords might restrict movement, seize grain, or prioritize their own households and obligations. Warfare, especially the kind that lingered rather than concluded, could destroy barns, mills, and vineyards, not necessarily through spectacular battles, but through the slow grind of foraging armies and unpaid garrisons. Refugees crowded into safer towns, raising prices and spreading illness. And in a society where many peasants owed fixed dues, a failed harvest could trap families in debt and dependency. Catastrophe, in other words, could be manufactured by the failure of coordination. Sometimes medieval people came closest to extinction not because nature produced too little, but because humans couldn't or wouldn't move what existed to where it was needed. There were also moments when the natural world seemed to turn predator in unexpected ways. Swarms of locusts are more common in certain climates, but medieval chronicles occasionally describe insect outbreaks that devoured fields and gardens with a speed that felt supernatural. Even without locusts, ordinary pests could be devastating. Rats and mice consumed stored grain. Birds could strip newly planted seed. In wet years, slugs and insects multiplied. None of these were dramatic in isolation, but medieval survival was a balance of margins. When the margin was thin, a sudden surge of pests could tip it. The bizarre element here is how medieval people experienced these events. Not as a predictable ecological cycle, but as an eruption, one more sign that the world was unstable and that human planning was fragile. What kept medieval Europe and other medieval societies from actually slipping into total collapse was not any single safeguard, but a patchwork of resilience. People diversified crops where they could, mixing grains, maintaining gardens, keeping small livestock. Communities built systems of mutual aid through churches, guilds, and kin networks. Towns sometimes stockpiled grain or arranged imports. After major population losses, survivors could sometimes access better land, higher wages, and improved diets, which in turn raised resistance to disease. And slowly, unevenly, knowledge accumulated. Better methods of drainage, more robust crop rotations, improved milling and storage, expanded trade links. Medieval people did not solve disaster, but they learned to live with its probability. Still, the larger lesson is sobering. The medieval world shows how close a society can live to the edge when most of its energy is spent simply feeding itself. It also shows how catastrophe can be quietly assembled from ordinary components. A few wet summers, weakened animals, contaminated grain, crowded roads, a disease that finds a malnourished host, a political decision that blocks movement, a market that fails at the wrong moment. None of this needs melodrama to be frightening. The fear is in the simplicity. A medieval family could do everything right. Plant, tend, harvest, store, pray, bargain, endure, and still be swept up by forces so large and so indifferent that the only honest description was, the world turned and we were not ready. And maybe that's why this topic keeps pulling in Tier 1 audiences. It's not just the shock of how harsh the past was. It's the recognition that survival, even now, is often a systems problem, a matter of margins, logistics, and timing. Medieval people almost went extinct in ways that can sound bizarre to us, but to them, it was the logical consequence of living in a landscape where nature, infrastructure, and authority could all fail at once. When we slow down and trace the cause and effect, the Middle Ages stop being a distant backdrop of castles and knights and start looking like a real human world. Clever, limited, resilient, and sometimes terrifyingly fragile. If we look beyond Europe, similar patterns emerge across the wider medieval world. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, medieval societies depended on complex irrigation networks that had been inherited, expanded, and carefully maintained over centuries. These systems transformed dry landscapes into productive farmland. But they also created a different kind of fragility. Canals required constant dredging. Dams required repair. Political stability was essential because labor had to be coordinated at scale. When wars disrupted administration or when plague reduced the workforce, irrigation could fail gradually. Fields that once produced reliable harvests reverted to salt-crusted soil or dust. The decline was often slow enough that people didn't recognize the tipping point until it had already passed. In this sense, extinction was not always a dramatic crash. Sometimes it was a quiet shrinking, a contraction of settlement and population over generations. In East Asia, medieval Chinese dynasties faced their own version of this delicate balance. Northern regions were especially vulnerable to climate fluctuations and incursions by nomadic confederations. Grain tribute systems moved food across vast distances to supply capitals and armies. When these systems functioned, they stabilized millions of lives. But transport relied on rivers, canals, and secure roads. Flooding of the Yellow River, one of the most unpredictable waterways in the world, could drown farmland and displace entire communities. The river's shifting course sometimes buried towns under silt or left them stranded away from water entirely. Medieval Chinese records show careful state responses: granaries, relief measures, tax remissions, but they also show moments when crisis outpaced capacity. A flood followed by famine followed by unrest could reduce regional populations dramatically. Again, the pattern repeats: vulnerability layered upon vulnerability. Even in regions that seemed comparatively insulated, such as parts of medieval Scandinavia or the Scottish Highlands, survival rested on narrow ecological margins. Growing seasons were short. Livestock were essential. A sequence of harsh winters could reduce herds to unsustainable levels. If animals died, manure declined. Without manure, crop yields suffered. And without both animals and grain, communities faced the prospect of migration. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some marginal areas, settlements were abandoned entirely during difficult climatic phases. Not because every person perished, but because the land no longer justified the effort. The medieval world was dotted with these ghost landscapes, places where people had once built, farmed, and buried their dead, then quietly retreated when the equation no longer worked. What makes these near-extinction moments particularly striking is how interconnected medieval threats were, even in an age before modern globalization. Trade routes tied distant regions together. A disease emerging in one zone could move steadily along merchant pathways. A military campaign could disrupt grain supplies far from the battlefield. Climatic anomalies, possibly linked to volcanic activity, could lower temperatures across hemispheres. Medieval people did not speak of global systems in modern scientific language, but they experienced the consequences of them. A merchant's ship docking in a port might bring prosperity one year and infection the next. A caravan crossing a desert might carry silk, spices, and, unintentionally, pathogens. The very networks that made medieval civilizations vibrant also made them exposed. Yet, despite these repeated brushes with collapse, medieval populations did not vanish. In many cases, they adapted in ways that reshaped society. After the Black Death, labor shortages altered the balance between peasants and landowners. In parts of Western Europe, wages rose and serfdom weakened. Diets improved for survivors because land was more abundant relative to population. Urban planning slowly evolved, with some towns implementing stricter sanitation measures. Agricultural techniques diversified, and crop rotation became more systematic. The lesson here is not that catastrophe was beneficial, it was devastating, but that demographic shocks sometimes created space for structural change. When we step back, the phrase "almost went extinct" captures something real but nuanced. Medieval societies were repeatedly pushed to the brink by famine, disease, environmental stress, and political fragmentation. Entire regions lost large portions of their populations within a few years. Villages disappeared. Dynasties fell. Cultural memory recorded these periods as times when the world seemed to unravel. And yet, extinction did not occur on a continental scale. The resilience lay in redundancy: multiple crops, multiple trade routes, layered social institutions, and the simple human instinct to relocate, reorganize, and rebuild. In many ways, the medieval experience reminds us that survival is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is incremental. It is the decision to plant again after a failed harvest. It is the choice to repair a canal after a flood. It is the negotiation of new labor terms after a plague has changed the balance of power. Medieval people lived with uncertainty as a constant companion. The bizarre ways they almost went extinct were not always spectacular disasters. They were the accumulation of small failures in systems that were already stretched thin. And perhaps that is why the story remains compelling today. There is also a quieter dimension to medieval near-extinction that rarely appears in dramatic retellings: the psychological weight of living in a world where explanation lagged behind experience. Medieval communities were observant. They kept chronicles, recorded unusual weather, described strange illnesses, and noted the rising and falling of prices. But they did not possess germ theory, atmospheric science, or modern economics. When crops failed repeatedly, or when illness returned season after season, the cause was not always clear. Some interpreted catastrophe through a religious lens, others through astrology, others through rumor. Uncertainty itself became a burden. Fear could alter behavior, encouraging flight from towns, reluctance to trade, suspicion of outsiders. In extreme cases, this social fragmentation made recovery harder. Markets require trust. Relief requires cooperation. When confidence collapsed alongside harvests, societies edged closer to breakdown. Another overlooked factor was demographic structure. Medieval populations were young, with high birth rates offset by high infant mortality. That balance worked barely when conditions were stable. But during prolonged crises, the loss of children had long-term consequences. A generation reduced by famine or disease meant fewer adults a decade later to farm, build, defend, and reproduce. Even if mortality stabilized, the population pyramid could remain distorted. Some regions took many decades to return to previous levels of settlement. In areas repeatedly struck by plague, historians have observed patterns of delayed marriage, reduced fertility, and shifting household structures. These changes were adaptive, but they also reflected the lingering shadow of loss. Extinction was avoided, yet demographic recovery was fragile and uneven. Technology, or the limits of it, formed another boundary. Medieval medicine contained practical knowledge, herbal remedies, surgical techniques, quarantine measures in later centuries, but it was constrained by prevailing theories of disease. Treatments often focused on balancing humors or adjusting diet and environment. In some cases, isolation of the sick helped reduce spread, but in many others, caregivers were exposed repeatedly. Hospitals and charitable institutions offered comfort and structure, yet they also concentrated vulnerable people together. Without antibiotics or vaccines, even minor infections could become fatal. This reality meant that during any widespread outbreak, mortality could climb quickly before communities understood what they were facing. Trade-offs were constant. Urbanization brought opportunity and specialization. Towns allowed craftsmen, merchants, and scholars to flourish, but dense populations also facilitated contagion. Expanding farmland fed growing populations, yet clearing forests sometimes increased erosion or altered local climates. Military fortifications offered security, but prolonged warfare drained treasuries and destroyed productive land. Medieval societies were dynamic and innovative, but innovation often carried new risks. The balance between growth and stability was delicate. And still, the overarching story is not one of helplessness. Medieval people developed risk management strategies suited to their world. Granaries were stocked in good years. Religious institutions organized almsgiving and relief. Merchant guilds formed networks that could redirect supplies when one region suffered. Maritime republics diversified their trading partners to reduce dependency on a single source. Even peasant households practiced small-scale diversification, maintaining gardens, raising poultry, preserving food through salting and drying. These were not perfect shields against catastrophe, but they reduced the likelihood that one failed harvest would erase an entire community. When we consider how often medieval societies approached demographic collapse, the remarkable fact is their continuity. Languages evolved but persisted. Legal systems adapted. Agricultural knowledge accumulated rather than disappearing. The almost extinct matters. It speaks to repeated confrontation with limits, ecological, medical, logistical, and to the steady, often quiet adjustments that followed. Medieval history, viewed this way, is not a sequence of dark catastrophes. It is a long negotiation with vulnerability. By the end of the Middle Ages, parts of Europe and Asia had developed more robust fiscal systems, more reliable trade corridors, and early forms of public health intervention. These changes did not eliminate famine or plague, but they altered their frequency and scale. The medieval world had been tested repeatedly. Each crisis exposed weaknesses, and each recovery left behind small improvements. Extinction remained a possibility in theory, but resilience had deepened in practice. So when we look back at the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really looking at the anatomy of fragile systems. Climate shifts, contaminated grain, river floods, animal die-offs, epidemic disease, political miscalculation, each alone was dangerous. Combined, they were formidable. Yet humanity, if we narrow the lens even further, down to the level of the individual household, the medieval brush with extinction becomes even more tangible. A typical rural family depended on a sequence of successful decisions. When to plow, when to sow, how much seed to risk in uncertain soil, how many animals to overwinter, how much grain to sell versus store. These decisions were made without forecasts, without insurance, and often without literacy. Knowledge was inherited through memory and observation. A miscalculation, planting too early before a late frost, keeping too many animals when fodder was scarce, could ripple forward for years. Multiply that uncertainty across thousands of households, and the fragility of the system becomes clear. Societal survival rested on millions of small judgments made under pressure. Urban families faced a different but equally precarious reality. Artisans relied on steady demand. A downturn caused by famine in the countryside could empty workshops in towns. If peasants had no surplus to sell, merchants had no goods to trade, and craftsmen had fewer customers. Economic contraction in the medieval world was not abstract. It meant unpaid apprentices, abandoned stalls, and reduced food intake. Cities that thrived on specialization could quickly feel the strain when regional agriculture faltered. The boundary between prosperity and hunger was thinner than modern audiences often assume. There were also cultural consequences to repeated crises. Art, literature, and religious practice absorbed the experience of living near the brink. Medieval sermons frequently addressed famine, pestilence, and moral responsibility. Chronicles recorded comets, eclipses, and storms alongside prices of grain, reflecting a worldview in which cosmic and earthly instability were intertwined. These records were not merely dramatic embellishments. They were attempts to understand patterns in survival and loss. Over time, this accumulation of memory shaped communal responses. A town that had endured plague before might respond more quickly to rumors of illness. A region scarred by flood might invest more heavily in embankments. Collective memory became a form of resilience. It is also important to recognize that almost extinction was rarely uniform. Some regions suffered catastrophic losses while others remained comparatively stable. Trade imbalances, geographic barriers, and political boundaries could insulate certain populations temporarily. This unevenness sometimes intensified long-term change. Areas less affected by plague or famine might expand economically while others contracted. Migration followed opportunity. Entire cultural landscapes shifted as people moved from marginal lands to more fertile zones. Medieval Europe, for example, saw waves of internal colonization during favorable climatic periods, followed by retreat during harsher phases. The map of settlement was fluid, responding to environmental and demographic pressure. By the late medieval period, gradual climatic cooling, often associated with the onset of the Little Ice Age, introduced new stresses. Shorter growing seasons and harsher winters compounded existing vulnerabilities. Yet societies did not simply endure passively. They experimented with hardier crop varieties, improved storage techniques, and, in some regions, expanded maritime trade to buffer against local shortages. Coastal communities increasingly relied on fishing as a supplementary food source, reducing exclusive dependence on grain. These adaptations did not eliminate hardship, but they widened the margin of safety. When we reflect on the medieval centuries as a whole, the recurring theme is proximity to limits. Population growth would expand until checked by resources. Resources would falter under climatic or political strain. Disease would exploit density and malnutrition. Then recovery would begin again, often on altered terms. The cycle was not perfectly predictable, but it was persistent. Extinction loomed not as a single apocalyptic event, but as the cumulative risk of many overlapping pressures. And yet, the enduring outcome is continuity. Medieval societies transformed profoundly between the early and late Middle Ages, but they did not disappear. Institutions matured. Trade networks broadened. Technological knowledge accumulated slowly but steadily. What appears at first glance to be a series of bizarre near-death experiences is, on closer inspection, a long training in resilience. The medieval world survived not because it was invulnerable, but because it adapted repeatedly, sometimes painfully, to the lessons imposed by famine, flood, pestilence, and conflict. In that sense, the Middle Ages offer more than dramatic stories of catastrophe. They provide a study in how human systems strain, fracture, and reconfigure under pressure. The fact that medieval people came so close to demographic collapse so often, and yet endured, remains one of the most revealing aspects of the period. As we move toward the close of this exploration, it helps to step back and consider just how normal instability was in the medieval world. Modern societies are built on buffers, global supply chains, advanced medicine, rapid communication, financial reserves. Medieval communities had far fewer cushions. A failed harvest could not be offset by shipments arriving within days from another continent. A spreading illness could not be analyzed in a laboratory and countered with targeted treatment. Information moved at the speed of a horse or a sail. Decisions were made locally, often with incomplete knowledge. In that environment, survival required a kind of practical resilience that was woven into daily life. One of the most striking features of medieval endurance is the adaptability of social structures. When labor became scarce after major plagues, landowners had to negotiate. Serfdom weakened in parts of Western Europe because workers suddenly possessed leverage. In other regions, authorities attempted to freeze wages or restrict mobility, revealing how demographic shock could reshape political priorities. Laws were rewritten, customs adjusted. What had once seemed permanent, rigid hierarchies, inherited obligations, proved more flexible than expected under pressure. The brush with extinction forced reconsideration of how society functioned. Religious institutions also played a complex role in survival. Monasteries preserved agricultural techniques, managed estates, and provided alms during famine. Urban parishes organized care for the sick and burial for the dead. While spiritual explanations for catastrophe were common, so too were practical responses rooted in charity and communal responsibility. Faith communities often became coordination points in times of crisis. In a world without centralized welfare systems, these networks were essential. They could not prevent widespread suffering, but they softened its edges and helped maintain continuity. Environmental knowledge, passed orally and through practice, gradually improved. Farmers experimented with three-field crop rotation, which reduced soil exhaustion. Watermills and windmills multiplied, increasing efficiency in grinding grain and processing materials. Better plows and harnesses allowed deeper tilling and more effective use of animal power. None of these innovations eliminated risk, but each one slightly increased productivity and reliability. Over generations, small gains accumulated. The margin between survival and collapse widened, even if only modestly. It is also worth noting that medieval extinction threats were often regional rather than universal. Europe experienced devastating plague in the 14th century, but other parts of the world faced different cycles of crisis. The Islamic world, South Asia, East Asia, and Africa each encountered environmental shifts, epidemics, and political upheavals unique to their contexts. Yet across these regions, the pattern remained consistent. Vulnerability exposed, adaptation attempted, survival negotiated. The medieval period was not uniformly dark. It was uneven, fluctuating, and deeply human. When we use the phrase "almost went extinct," it captures the intensity of demographic loss in certain moments. Entire villages abandoned, cities half emptied, dynasties toppled. But extinction implies finality, and the medieval centuries are defined more by transformation than disappearance. Populations contracted and expanded. Borders shifted. Economies reoriented. From the wreckage of one crisis emerged new arrangements of power, labor, and belief. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval survival is its quietness. There was no single turning point where the danger definitively passed. Instead, recovery unfolded slowly. Children were born into a world still marked by plague but slightly more prepared for it. Fields were replanted where weeds had grown. Markets reopened along roads that had once been silent. Life resumed not because risk vanished, but because people continued. And that may be the most enduring lesson. Medieval societies stood repeatedly at the edge of demographic collapse due to climate fluctuations, contaminated food, disease, warfare, and fragile logistics. The threats were real, sometimes overwhelming. Yet humanity's capacity to reorganize, to preserve knowledge, and to rebuild institutions prevented true extinction. The Middle Ages remind us that survival is rarely dramatic. It is patient. It is cumulative. It is the steady decision, generation after generation, to begin again despite uncertainty. If we bring all of this together, the medieval experience begins to look less like a sequence of isolated disasters and more like a long experiment in endurance. The margin between stability and collapse was narrow, but it was constantly being tested, adjusted, and reinforced. What makes the period feel so precarious to modern observers is not simply the scale of famine or plague. but how frequently multiple pressures converged at once. A poor harvest alone was survivable. A disease outbreak alone, though devastating, could eventually burn out. But when failed crops weakened bodies, when trade routes carried infection, when political conflict disrupted relief, the cumulative effect pushed societies to the brink. Even so, medieval extinction never became absolute. Human communities retained mobility. When land became infertile or dangerous, people moved. When one trade network failed, merchants sought another. When labor was scarce, innovation became more attractive. Windmills spread across northern Europe not because life was easy, but because efficiency mattered in a world of tight margins. Maritime exploration expanded in part because access to reliable food and trade was a constant concern. Pressure encouraged experimentation. There is also an important generational dimension. Medieval children grew up hearing stories of famine years, of plague seasons, of winters when livestock perished. These memories were not abstract. They shaped how families stored food, chose marriage partners, and evaluated risk. Resilience was cultural as much as economic. Communities developed traditions around harvest festivals, communal baking, shared grazing rights, and mutual defense. These practices were not merely symbolic. They were structural supports in times of strain. In many ways, the medieval world teaches us that extinction is rarely a single moment. It is a threshold approached through accumulation. Soil slowly depleted. Rivers gradually shifted course. Populations grew beyond what local ecosystems could comfortably sustain. And yet, because these processes unfolded over years or decades, they often allowed room for response. The story of almost extinction is therefore not only about vulnerability but about timing, about whether adaptation could move quickly enough to meet new conditions. By the 15th century, parts of Europe were emerging into what historians often describe as a period of recovery and transformation. Urban centers regained population. Trade intensified across the Mediterranean and the North Sea. Agricultural yields stabilized in many regions. This did not mean that famine and disease disappeared. They remained part of life. But the systems supporting society had become more layered and diversified than in earlier centuries. The cumulative knowledge of surviving repeated crises had strengthened the foundations. When we look back calmly, without dramatization, what stands out is the remarkable continuity of human presence. Despite waves of mortality that sometimes removed a third or even half of local populations, languages persisted, craftsmanship evolved, and institutions endured. The medieval period was not a fragile pause between ancient and modern times. It was a resilient era that absorbed shocks and reshaped itself repeatedly. So the phrase "bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct" captures attention, but the deeper truth is more subtle. The Middle Ages reveal how interconnected environmental, biological, and political systems can push societies to their limits. They also reveal how adaptation, cooperation, and incremental innovation can prevent total collapse. Extinction hovered close, not as spectacle but as possibility. And the fact that it did not occur on a civilizational scale is a testament to the persistent, ordinary efforts of countless unnamed individuals. In the end, Medieval survival was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was practical. It was communal. It was built on memory, adjustment, and endurance. And perhaps that is what makes the story so enduring for us today. The recognition that even in an age of uncertainty, human societies have faced the edge before and found ways, slowly and imperfectly, to step back from it. As we take one final, steady look at the medieval world, it becomes clear that what feels bizarre to us was, for them, simply reality. The edge was always there. Survival depended on systems that were impressive for their time, yet fragile by necessity. Agriculture relied on muscle power, animal strength, and predictable seasons. Medicine relied on observation without microscopes. Trade relied on wind, river currents, and safe passage through contested territories. There was no surplus of certainty, and yet the medieval centuries were not defined by disappearance. They were defined by adjustment. One of the most important long-term safeguards against extinction was diversity, geographic, economic, and cultural. Europe, for example, was not a single agricultural zone. When northern regions struggled with cold and wet conditions, Mediterranean areas sometimes experienced different patterns. Grain shortages in one region could, at least in theory, be offset by imports from another. The expansion of maritime trade during the later Middle Ages increasingly allowed this buffering effect. Italian city-states, Hanseatic merchants in the Baltic, and Islamic trading networks across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean created overlapping systems of exchange. These networks were not immune to disruption, but they made total isolation less likely. The same principle applied within societies. Medieval economies were never purely agrarian. Even in overwhelmingly rural regions, craft production, fishing, forestry, and pastoralism supplemented grain farming. When one sector failed, another sometimes absorbed the shock. Coastal communities turned to the sea when harvests faltered. Highland populations relied more heavily on livestock when crops were unreliable. This diversification did not eliminate famine, but it reduced the odds that a single ecological failure would wipe out an entire people. Political evolution also played a quiet role in long-term survival. Over time, monarchies and city governments developed more systematic taxation and record-keeping. With records came planning. Granaries were monitored. Relief funds were sometimes organized. Quarantine practices began to appear in port cities after repeated plague outbreaks. Venice, for instance, pioneered structured isolation measures for arriving ships. These responses were imperfect and limited by contemporary knowledge, but they represented learning. Each crisis left administrative traces. Those traces shaped the next response. It is important to emphasize that medieval people did not think of themselves as living in a uniquely doomed age. They feared divine judgment, bad harvests, war, and illness. But they also married, traded, built cathedrals, wrote poetry, and founded universities. The very existence of long-term institutions, monasteries operating for centuries, guilds regulating trades across generations, demonstrates a confidence in continuity. Extinction was possible in theory, but daily life assumed tomorrow would come. Demographic collapse, when it occurred, reshaped rather than erased societies. After the Black Death, labor scarcity encouraged technological substitution in some regions. Water power became more valuable. Land that had once been marginal was abandoned, allowing forests to regrow in certain areas. Ecological recovery in turn affected wildlife patterns and even local climate dynamics. The medieval world was dynamic in ways that are only now fully appreciated. Population loss did not freeze history, it redirected it. When we reflect on how medieval people almost went extinct, we are really reflecting on how close any pre-modern society could come to collapse under compounding stress. Climate variability, limited medical knowledge, logistical fragility, and political fragmentation created constant risk. But extinction requires more than risk. It requires a failure to adapt. And adaptation, slow, uneven, sometimes accidental, was something medieval societies repeatedly achieved. In the end, the story is not one of miraculous survival against impossible odds. It is a story of systems under pressure. When harvests failed, people rationed and replanted. When disease struck, they isolated where they could and carried on where they must. When political orders fractured, new arrangements eventually emerged. Medieval survival was not dramatic. It was cumulative. It was built on memory, cooperation, and incremental improvement. And that may be the most compelling takeaway for us. The Middle Ages were not a dark void between brighter eras. They were centuries of negotiation with vulnerability. Time and again, societies approached the brink through famine, flood, pestilence, and conflict. Time and again, they reorganized just enough to continue. Extinction hovered close, but continuity prevailed. If we allow ourselves one final, measured reflection, the medieval story of almost extinction becomes less about spectacle and more about thresholds. Medieval societies were repeatedly brought to points where their existing structures, agricultural, medical, political, were no longer sufficient for the pressures they faced. What determined survival was not strength in the heroic sense, but elasticity. How far could a community bend before it broke? How quickly could it reorganize when familiar patterns failed? Consider again the agricultural foundation. Medieval farming was sophisticated within its constraints. Crop rotation, communal field systems, shared grazing rights, and seasonal labor rhythms were all finely tuned to local environments. But these systems assumed relative climatic stability. When the climate shifted even slightly, the tuning faltered. The early 14th century sequence of cold, wet years did not just reduce harvests. It exposed how dependent medieval populations were on narrow seasonal windows. A delay of weeks could echo through an entire year's food supply. That fragility is what brought communities so close to demographic collapse. And yet, those same communal systems also facilitated recovery. Shared fields meant shared risk. Villages coordinated planting and harvesting. Grain might be redistributed within a manor or parish to prevent total ruin for one family. Obligations between lords and peasants, while often unequal, sometimes required protection and relief in exchange for labor. In other words, hierarchy could become a stabilizing force as well as a source of strain. The medieval world was not uniformly oppressive nor uniformly cooperative. It was a layered network of dependencies that, at times, absorbed shock. Disease presents a similar duality. The Black Death remains the most dramatic example, but it was only one wave in a broader pattern of epidemic vulnerability. What made plague so devastating was not only the pathogen itself, but the density of towns, the reach of trade routes, and the nutritional weakness of populations emerging from famine. Yet the aftermath reshaped Europe's economic balance. Labor became more valuable. Serfdom declined in some regions. Innovation accelerated where manpower was scarce. Tragedy, while immense, altered incentives in ways that ultimately strengthened certain aspects of society. The edge of extinction forced adaptation. Political fragmentation also carried both danger and resilience. Medieval Europe, for example, was divided into kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and ecclesiastical territories. This patchwork could hinder coordinated response during crisis. Borders complicated relief. Warfare disrupted production. But fragmentation also prevented uniform collapse. When one region suffered extreme loss, another might remain comparatively stable. Diversity of governance meant diversity of response. Some rulers implemented grain controls. Others encouraged imports. Still others reduced taxes. Not all policies succeeded, but experimentation increased the chances that at least some societies would stabilize. Across Eurasia and beyond, similar dynamics unfolded. Irrigation networks in the Islamic world required maintenance and central oversight. When strong administration faltered, agricultural productivity declined. Yet trade across the Indian Ocean connected distant markets, spreading both goods and ideas. Chinese dynasties faced catastrophic floods and invasions, yet their bureaucratic systems preserved agricultural knowledge and tax records that supported recovery. In each case, vulnerability and capacity coexisted. Perhaps the most profound reason medieval societies avoided true extinction was demographic momentum. Even after catastrophic mortality, enough survivors remained to rebuild. Family structures, however strained, regenerated populations over time. Cultural continuity did not require every village to survive intact. It required memory, language, and practice to persist somewhere. As long as knowledge of farming techniques, craftsmanship, and governance endured, society could reassemble itself. There is also a psychological dimension worth considering. Medieval people expected hardship. This expectation did not make famine or plague less painful, but it shaped preparation. Storing grain, preserving meat with salt, maintaining kinship ties across regions. These were not optional habits. They were embedded in survival culture. Resilience was normalized. A bad year did not immediately signal apocalypse. It signaled caution. Only when multiple bad years accumulated did true fear of collapse set in. By the later Middle Ages, the cumulative experience of crisis had left its mark. Administrative records became more detailed. Urban planning incorporated sanitation awareness. Maritime trade networks expanded to reduce dependency on local harvests. Agricultural techniques diversified further. None of these developments erased risk. but they broadened the safety margin. The world remained uncertain, yet it was incrementally more buffered than before. So when we say medieval people almost went extinct, what we truly mean is that their systems were repeatedly pushed beyond comfortable limits. Climate fluctuation, contaminated food, pest infestations, warfare, epidemic disease, all converged in ways that made collapse conceivable. But extinction requires finality, and finality never fully arrived. Instead, history records contraction followed by recalibration, loss followed by reorganization. As we close this long journey through the medieval world, it is worth sitting quietly with one final question. What actually prevents extinction? The Middle Ages offer no dramatic final battle against annihilation, no single reform that permanently secured stability. Instead, they reveal a layered answer. Extinction is prevented not by perfection, but by redundancy. Not by certainty, but by flexibility. Not by eliminating risk, but by distributing it. Medieval societies survived because they were not built on a single pillar. Agriculture formed the base, but it was supported by trade, by faith institutions, by kinship networks, by customary law, and by evolving governance. When one pillar cracked, the others bore weight, sometimes barely, sometimes unevenly, but often long enough for repairs to begin. A famine weakened bodies, yet monasteries and guilds redistributed food. A plague emptied villages, yet surviving towns absorbed migrants. A war devastated one territory, yet neighboring regions continued to produce and trade. The interconnectedness that spread crisis also carried recovery. We should also remember that medieval extinction fears were local and immediate. A peasant family watching crops fail for a second consecutive year did not think in continental terms. Their world was the village, the parish, the nearby market town. If that world emptied, extinction felt real. Archaeology confirms that entire settlements vanished in certain periods. Fields reverted to forest. Churches fell silent. For those communities, collapse was complete. But elsewhere, life continued. The medieval map was constantly redrawn, not only by kings and armies, but by climate, disease, and migration. Extinction at one scale could coexist with continuity at another. Environmental limits remained the most persistent pressure. The medieval warm period had allowed population growth in parts of Europe, supporting expansion into marginal lands. When temperatures cooled and weather patterns destabilized, those marginal lands were often the first to be abandoned. Highland farms, exposed coastal settlements, and poorly drained fields proved unsustainable. Yet retreat from marginal zones sometimes strengthened core areas. Better soils were consolidated. Labor concentrated where productivity was higher. What looked like contraction could also be strategic realignment imposed by necessity. Knowledge accumulation was subtle but decisive. Medieval farmers refined plow designs, improved harness systems for horses, and spread three-field rotation across wider regions. These adjustments increased yields incrementally. In isolation, each improvement seemed modest. Together, over centuries, they shifted the baseline of food security. Similarly, merchant communities improved accounting practices, maritime navigation, and credit systems. Economic shocks remained common, but the capacity to coordinate across distance gradually strengthened. The experience of repeated plague outbreaks also transformed public health awareness. Italian port cities pioneered quarantine stations, isolating ships before allowing entry. While understanding of disease transmission was incomplete, observation led to precaution. Municipal regulations regarding waste disposal, burial practices, and urban cleanliness became more structured in some regions. These measures did not eliminate epidemic risk, but they reflected learning under pressure. It is tempting to imagine medieval survival as purely reactive, a world constantly scrambling to respond to disaster. But there was also foresight. Grain storage, communal rights, seasonal labor coordination, and long-distance trade agreements all represented anticipation of uncertainty. Medieval people did not assume stability. They assumed fluctuation. This expectation shaped behavior. Surplus years were not simply times of celebration. They were opportunities to prepare for scarcity. And perhaps the most powerful barrier against extinction was cultural continuity. Language, belief systems, craftsmanship, and oral tradition ensured that even when populations declined, identity persisted. A monastery destroyed by war might be rebuilt decades later because its memory endured. A farming technique might survive in one valley even if abandoned in another. Human societies are resilient not only because of material adaptation, but because of shared meaning. Medieval communities understood themselves as part of ongoing narratives, religious, familial, regional. That continuity anchored rebuilding efforts after crisis. When we look across the medieval centuries as a whole, extinction never arrived in total form. There were catastrophic episodes, the Great Famine, the Black Death, regional collapses of irrigation or trade, but each was followed by recalibration. Population curves dipped and rose. Power shifted. Economies reorganized. The world of 1500 was not identical to that of 1000, but it was unmistakably connected to it. So the phrase "bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct" captures attention, yet the deeper truth is more measured. Medieval societies operated close to ecological and medical limits. Climate instability, food contamination, pest outbreaks, warfare, and epidemic disease repeatedly pushed them toward demographic collapse. What prevented extinction was not luck alone. It was distributed resilience, diverse economies, adaptable governance, communal memory, and incremental innovation. The Middle Ages were not a dark void waiting to be rescued by modernity. They were a prolonged demonstration of how human systems endure under constraint. Time and again, medieval people confronted the edge of viability. If we slow down even further and imagine the medieval centuries not as distant history but as lived experience, the proximity to extinction becomes less abstract. It becomes seasonal. It becomes personal. A late frost, a sick child, an empty granary, a rumor of illness in the next town. The medieval world was a place where warning signs were felt long before they were measured. And yet, survival was built into its rhythms. One of the defining characteristics of medieval life was repetition. Seasons returned. Fields were replanted. Markets reopened. Even after catastrophe, the calendar continued. This cyclical structure of time helped stabilize societies under strain. When famine struck, people did not assume permanence. They endured winter in expectation of spring. That expectation was not naive optimism, it was agricultural logic. Crops fail, but they are also replanted. Herds diminish, but they breed again. This pattern of return created psychological resilience. Extinction would have required a permanent break in the cycle. More often, medieval crises were severe interruptions, not final endings. Migration also acted as a release valve. Medieval populations were not immobile. Peasants relocated in search of better land. Artisans moved to towns with stronger demand. After plague reduced urban populations, migrants filled the gaps. Frontier regions in Eastern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and parts of Scandinavia attracted settlers during periods of recovery. This movement redistributed demographic pressure. Instead of collapsing inward completely, societies expanded and contracted geographically. Extinction was avoided because people could reposition themselves within a wider landscape. There is also an ecological dimension that often goes unnoticed. When human populations declined sharply, especially after the Black Death, natural systems responded. Forests regrew on abandoned farmland. Wildlife populations shifted. Soil fertility sometimes improved after years of reduced cultivation. These environmental resets created conditions for renewed agricultural productivity in later generations. Ironically, demographic loss could temporarily ease ecological strain. Medieval extinction was prevented in part because nature, given brief reprieve, restored some of what had been overextended. We should also consider the role of knowledge preservation. Monastic scriptoria, Islamic scholarly centers, Chinese bureaucratic archives, all safeguarded agricultural, medical, and administrative knowledge across turbulent centuries. Even when cities burned or regimes fell, written and oral traditions often survived in fragments. Those fragments mattered. A preserved treatise on irrigation, a remembered crop rotation method, or a legal code could guide reconstruction. Cultural extinction requires the loss of memory. Medieval societies, despite enormous upheaval, rarely lost memory entirely. Economic diversification deepened gradually over the later Middle Ages. Banking systems emerged in Italian city-states. Credit networks extended across regions. The Hanseatic League connected Northern Europe through maritime commerce. Islamic trade networks spanned from West Africa to Southeast Asia. These systems increased exposure to risk, but they also distributed it. A harvest failure in one region did not automatically doom another if trade corridors remained open. The ability to move goods, grain, salt, dried fish became a crucial defense against localized collapse. At the same time, governance slowly matured. Tax records, census attempts, land surveys, and urban statutes provided rulers with better information. Better information did not eliminate hardship, but it improved coordination. Relief measures, even if imperfect, could be targeted. Military campaigns could be supplied more efficiently, reducing random devastation. Quarantine policies, especially in Mediterranean port cities, demonstrated practical learning from repeated epidemic waves. These incremental bureaucratic advances widened the buffer against extinction. Still, none of this meant safety in the modern sense. The medieval world remained exposed to sudden shocks. Volcanic eruptions could cool climates for years. River floods could erase harvests overnight. War could devastate a generation's labor. But extinction requires sustained failure across all systems simultaneously. Medieval societies, for all their fragility, rarely failed everywhere at once. Diversity in climate zones, in political structures, in economic models acted as insurance. Perhaps the most important insight is that medieval survival was collective. No single individual, no single ruler guaranteed continuity. It was the accumulation of countless small acts. Storing surplus grain, sharing seed with a neighbor, repairing a dike, recording a contract, teaching a craft to an apprentice. These acts rarely appear in dramatic chronicles, yet they formed the foundation of endurance. Extinction was avoided not by spectacle, but by habit. By the dawn of the early modern period, the medieval world had already demonstrated extraordinary resilience. It had absorbed famine cycles, epidemic devastation, environmental fluctuation, and political fragmentation. Populations had risen, fallen, and risen again. Institutions had adapted. Trade had expanded. The world was not stable, but it was durable. So when we reflect on the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, what emerges is not a story of perpetual darkness. It is a story of tension between vulnerability and adaptation. Medieval societies lived close to ecological and medical limits. They were repeatedly pushed toward demographic collapse. If we let the story settle, one final pattern comes into focus. Medieval people almost went extinct not because they were careless or primitive, but because they lived inside systems with very little slack. Most energy went toward maintaining the basics: food production, shelter, order, faith, trade. When those basics were disturbed, there was rarely excess capacity waiting in reserve. That lack of slack is what made every disruption feel existential. Imagine a region after 2-week harvests. Seed stores are diminished. Livestock herds are smaller. Debts have accumulated. Then, before recovery is complete, disease arrives. Not necessarily the Black Death, but a harsh epidemic of influenza or dysentery. Labor declines just when fields need attention. Surviving workers are weaker from malnutrition. Grain prices rise. Migration begins. In isolation, each of these pressures is survivable. Together, they compress a society to its limits. Medieval extinction fears were born in those compressions, moments when every margin narrowed at once. Yet the very compression often triggered change. Scarcity forced renegotiation. Landlords offered incentives to attract tenants back to abandoned fields. Towns granted privileges to encourage settlement. Skilled workers found themselves in demand. Innovation became attractive when labor was short. Water-powered technology expanded. Textile production reorganized. Economic realignment followed demographic shock. In this way, crisis functioned as both threat and catalyst. We should also recognize that medieval resilience was uneven and imperfect. Many individuals did not survive famine or plague. Entire communities vanished permanently. Cultural traditions were lost in certain regions. The avoidance of total extinction does not erase immense suffering. It simply highlights that collapse at one scale did not equal disappearance at all scales. Human networks extended beyond any single village or city. That distributed structure preserved continuity. Another factor that prevented extinction was gradual integration across regions. By the later Middle Ages, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia were increasingly linked through commerce and diplomacy. Even when conflict interrupted these links, they tended to reemerge. Trade in grain, timber, metals, and textiles created interdependence. Interdependence carried risk, but it also created opportunity. A shortage in one region could draw supply from another. The system was fragile, yet it was broader than in earlier centuries. Environmental adaptation continued as well. Communities built dikes and drainage systems in low-lying areas. Terracing improved agricultural stability in mountainous regions. Crop choices shifted gradually toward varieties better suited to changing climates. Fishing intensified in the North Atlantic as preserved fish became a reliable trade commodity. Each adjustment slightly diversified food sources. The reliance on a single harvest lessened over time, even if only marginally. Cultural institutions reinforced endurance. Universities emerged, preserving and expanding knowledge in medicine, law, and natural philosophy. Legal traditions evolved, offering more predictable dispute resolution. Written contracts increased commercial trust. These developments did not directly prevent famine or plague, but they stabilized the broader framework within which recovery occurred. Stability in governance and learning reduced the chance that crisis would spiral into permanent fragmentation. The medieval relationship with uncertainty may be the most revealing element of all. People expected unpredictability. They built their lives around seasonal risk. Festivals followed harvest. Fasting followed abundance. Labor followed daylight. The rhythm of uncertainty was embedded in daily experience. That familiarity with fluctuation fostered adaptability. Modern observers may see fragility. Medieval people saw reality. They did not assume a permanently secure world. By the 15th century, despite repeated brushes with demographic catastrophe, Europe and other medieval societies were positioned not for extinction but for transformation. Urban populations stabilized. Long-distance navigation improved. Printing would soon amplify knowledge transmission. The same civilization that had nearly fractured under famine and plague was preparing, quietly, gradually, for expansion. So in the end, the story of how medieval people almost went extinct is not a tale of constant disaster, nor is it one of miraculous survival. It is a study in limits. It shows what happens when ecological capacity, medical knowledge, and political organization operate near their thresholds. It shows how quickly multiple stresses can converge. And it shows how distributed resilience, migration, trade, communal memory, incremental innovation can prevent final collapse. Extinction was conceivable. it was feared. At times, it seemed close enough to touch. But medieval societies endured not through dramatic rescue, but through cumulative adjustment. The edge was always present, so was the instinct to adapt. And that quiet, persistent adaptation is perhaps the most powerful legacy the Middle Ages leave behind. As we draw this final thread together, it becomes clear that the medieval world survived not because it was shielded from catastrophe, but because catastrophe was woven into its expectations. The people of the Middle Ages lived with an awareness, sometimes conscious, sometimes instinctive, that stability was temporary. Harvests fluctuated, illness returned, political loyalties shifted, rivers changed course. This constant negotiation with uncertainty shaped a civilization that was far more adaptive than it first appears. If extinction had come, it would not have arrived as a single dramatic moment. It would have emerged through cascading failures, soil exhausted beyond recovery, trade permanently severed, governance collapsing across entire regions, knowledge lost without preservation. What prevented that chain reaction was decentralization. Medieval societies were fragmented in ways that often caused conflict, but that same fragmentation limited systemic collapse. A failed kingdom did not mean a failed continent. A devastated city did not erase surrounding rural life. Diversity of structure, political, economic, ecological, acted as a form of insulation. Take, for example, the recovery patterns after the Black Death. In some parts of Europe, population loss exceeded a third. Entire parishes recorded drastic reductions in households. Yet within a generation, fields were cultivated again. Abandoned land was claimed. Labor contracts were rewritten. In certain areas, peasants gained mobility and bargaining power that had been unimaginable a century earlier. While tragedy reshaped society, it did not extinguish it. Instead, it accelerated shifts already underway: urban growth, wage labor, technological substitution. Across the Mediterranean and into Asia, similar recalibrations occurred. Trade routes shifted emphasis rather than disappearing outright. The Silk Road waxed and waned with political stability, but maritime trade increasingly filled the gap. Islamic commercial networks connected East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia, distributing goods and agricultural products across wide distances. Chinese state granary systems attempted to stabilize food supply through redistribution. None of these systems were flawless, yet each added layers to survival. Climate remained an unpredictable force. The gradual cooling associated with the early phases of the Little Ice Age tested agriculture repeatedly. Shorter growing seasons reduced yields in northern latitudes. Yet communities adapted by refining crop choices, diversifying food sources, and intensifying local trade. Fishing industries expanded dramatically in the North Atlantic, providing preserved protein that could be transported inland. This expansion was not merely economic growth. It was risk management on a continental scale. Knowledge continuity also deepened over time. Manuscripts preserved agricultural techniques and medicinal practices. Universities debated natural philosophy and disease theory. Administrative record-keeping improved rulers' ability to respond to crisis. Even when scientific understanding was incomplete, accumulated observation mattered. Patterns were noticed. Responses were refined. Medieval societies did not stand still between disasters. They learned incrementally from them. It is also important to consider how identity sustained continuity. Religious institutions, kinship networks, guilds, and local customs provided stability even when external conditions faltered. A village might lose half its population, but surviving families maintained rituals, property boundaries, and shared memory. Cultural extinction requires not only death, but the loss of meaning. Medieval communities preserved meaning through tradition and collective practice. Perhaps the most revealing lesson is that medieval extinction never arrived because collapse was rarely universal. The medieval world was not a single organism. It was a web. Some threads frayed, others strengthened. Regions declined while others advanced. Migration redistributed skills and labor. Trade realigned economic gravity. Each crisis reshaped the web rather than tearing it apart entirely. When modern audiences hear that medieval people almost went extinct, the phrase captures attention because it suggests finality narrowly avoided. But the deeper reality is more nuanced. The Middle Ages were a prolonged period of systemic stress testing. Agriculture operated near ecological limits. Medicine operated without germ theory. Governance operated without modern bureaucracy. And yet, through diversification, adaptation, and memory, societies endured. Extinction hovered at the margins of possibility. But continuity, sustained by countless small acts of resilience, proved stronger. Fields were replanted. Trade ships sailed again. Laws were rewritten. Children were born into a world that had survived another crisis. And in that steady return, after famine, after plague, after flood, we find the true story of the medieval world. Not a civilization perpetually collapsing, but one persistently recalibrating. Not a people on the brink of disappearance, but a society learning generation by generation how close it could come to the edge and how to step back once more. If we take one last, unhurried view of the medieval centuries, what stands out most is not how often people faced catastrophe, but how normal recovery became. The brink was familiar territory. Famine, plague, flood, invasion. These were not once-in-a-millennium anomalies. They were recurring pressures in a world with limited margins. And yet, extinction never took hold in the absolute sense. What prevented it was not a single turning point, but a pattern of renewal that repeated across regions and generations. Medieval societies functioned through layered interdependence. A village depended on its fields, but also on nearby markets. A town relied on surrounding countryside, but also on distant trade partners. A kingdom needed agricultural output, but also administrative coordination. This interdependence could transmit crisis rapidly, but it also transmitted recovery. When one node weakened, others sometimes compensated. Grain moved along rivers. Livestock were traded across borders. Skilled workers migrated to places with demand. These flows did not eliminate suffering, but they reduced the likelihood of permanent collapse. It is also important to understand how demographic contraction reshaped economic balance. After large mortality events, especially the Black Death, Europe experienced labor scarcity. That scarcity shifted power. Peasants could negotiate better terms. Wages rose in many regions. Consumption patterns changed. Diets diversified where land was plentiful relative to population. In some cases, survivors experienced improved living standards compared to pre-plague conditions. This paradox, tragedy followed by structural rebalancing, was a key reason extinction did not cascade into irreversible decline. Environmental systems, too, responded dynamically. When farmland was abandoned, forests reclaimed space. Soil, relieved from overuse, gradually recovered nutrients. Wildlife patterns shifted. These ecological resets did not occur everywhere, but where they did, they created conditions for renewed productivity. Medieval societies were not separate from nature, they were deeply embedded within it. When human pressure eased temporarily, ecosystems often stabilized, allowing for future agricultural cycles. Political evolution reinforced resilience over time. Governance became more document-based. Taxation systems grew more organized. Urban councils codified sanitation rules and trade regulations. Ports developed quarantine measures after repeated exposure to epidemic waves. None of these innovations were perfect. Many failed in the short term, but cumulatively, they strengthened institutional memory. Medieval civilization did not forget its crises. It incorporated lessons from them. Cultural continuity played an equally powerful role. Even when mortality was staggering, cultural frameworks persisted. Religious institutions preserved texts and agricultural knowledge. Guilds maintained craftsmanship standards. Oral tradition carried stories of past hardship that informed present caution. Memory prevented societies from repeating every mistake. A region that had suffered flood might invest more heavily in embankments. A city scarred by plague might respond more swiftly to signs of new contagion. Learning was gradual, but it was real. What makes the medieval near-extinction narrative compelling is how close systems operated to their thresholds. Population growth often pressed against food supply. Climate variation could tip balance quickly. Medicine could not yet interrupt disease cycles effectively. But total extinction requires synchronized collapse across every domain: ecological, political, economic, and cultural. Medieval history shows repeated strain, but rarely synchronized failure at all levels. Diversity of geography, governance, and economy acted as distributed insurance. By the late Middle Ages, this distributed resilience positioned societies for transition rather than disappearance. Urban networks expanded. Maritime exploration intensified. Financial instruments grew more sophisticated. Printing would soon revolutionize knowledge distribution. The same world that had endured famine and plague was now poised for transformation. Extinction did not define it. Adaptation did. In the end, the phrase "bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct" captures attention because it highlights vulnerability. But vulnerability alone does not determine fate. The medieval centuries demonstrate that societies can endure repeated systemic shocks if they retain flexibility, memory, and interconnection. Survival was not dramatic. It was cumulative. It was embedded in planting another field, reopening another market, rewriting another charter. The edge was never far away, but neither was the instinct to rebuild. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the headline. Medieval civilization survived not because catastrophe was rare, but because adaptation was constant. As we reach the quiet end of this long reflection, it helps to understand that the medieval world was never standing still. It was not a frozen, fragile era waiting to collapse. It was dynamic, reactive, and constantly recalibrating. The reason extinction never fully arrived is because medieval society was always in motion, economically, geographically, and intellectually. One of the clearest examples of this motion is urban growth and contraction. Medieval cities rose, shrank, and rose again. After epidemic waves reduced urban populations, surviving residents reorganized space. Abandoned houses were reclaimed. Workshops reopened. Infrastructure was repaired. In some cases, cities redesigned elements of their layout, widening streets, adjusting markets, regulating waste disposal. These were not modern urban planning projects in the contemporary sense, but they reflected practical learning. A city that had endured disease once became more attentive to the conditions that allowed it to spread. Trade networks also demonstrated remarkable elasticity. When land routes were threatened by war or political instability, maritime routes gained prominence. Italian merchant republics such as Venice and Genoa expanded their fleets. Northern European traders formed alliances like the Hanseatic League to secure shipping corridors. Across the Islamic world, caravan and maritime trade adjusted to shifting political boundaries. The very existence of multiple overlapping networks prevented total economic isolation. Extinction would have required these systems to fail simultaneously across continents. History shows strain, but not universal shutdown. Agricultural practice continued to evolve in subtle but meaningful ways. Crop rotation systems became more standardized in parts of Europe. Drainage projects reclaimed marshland. In mountainous regions, terracing reduced erosion and stabilized yields. Communities experimented with hardier grain varieties better suited to cooler temperatures during the onset of the Little Ice Age. These incremental refinements did not create abundance in the modern sense, but they increased reliability. Over generations, reliability widened the buffer against collapse. There is also a generational resilience that is easy to overlook. Medieval parents who had endured famine or plague adjusted how they prepared their children for uncertainty. Skills were emphasized: food preservation, livestock care, trade literacy. Apprenticeship systems ensured knowledge transfer even when populations dipped. Survival knowledge was embedded in daily life. Extinction requires a break in that chain of transmission. The medieval world, despite heavy losses, rarely experienced complete interruption of knowledge flow. Environmental variability remained a constant test. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Drought struck in cycles. Volcanic eruptions could lower temperatures globally for years. Yet medieval communities responded with infrastructure where possible: dikes in the Low Countries, irrigation channels in Islamic lands, reservoir systems in parts of Asia. Even when these systems faltered, they demonstrated an understanding that stability required intervention. People did not simply accept environmental risk. They worked against it with the tools available. Political systems, too, adapted under pressure. Feudal obligations evolved into more monetized relationships. Tax systems became more regularized. Written law codes expanded. These developments allowed rulers to mobilize resources more efficiently during crisis. Central authority remained uneven and often contested, but administrative sophistication increased over time. Each reform, however imperfect, reduced the probability that localized disaster would spiral into total fragmentation. What becomes evident is that medieval societies survived because they diversified their risks across space and structure. Climatic stress in one region did not mirror conditions everywhere. Political upheaval in one kingdom did not automatically erase institutions elsewhere. Trade routes rerouted. Migrants relocated. Cultural memory preserved continuity. The web stretched but did not fully tear. And perhaps the most powerful safeguard was human adaptability itself. Medieval people were not unaware of their vulnerability. Chronicles record fear, prayer, and confusion, but also resolve. Fields were replanted after flood. Markets reopened after war. Communities rebuilt churches and homes after devastation. The repetition of rebuilding became a cultural norm. Extinction requires surrender. Medieval societies, despite suffering, rarely surrendered collectively. By the close of the medieval era, the accumulated experience of surviving repeated crises had forged systems more layered and interconnected than before. Urban commerce expanded. Maritime exploration reached farther horizons. Knowledge circulation accelerated. The civilization that had endured famine, plague, environmental instability, and conflict was not extinguished. It was transforming. So when we consider the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really observing how close complex systems can operate to their limits. The Middle Ages were defined by narrow margins and recurring shocks. Yet they were also defined by persistence, by distributed resilience across families, villages, cities, and empires. Extinction lingered as possibility, but continuity, built from countless acts of adaptation, proved stronger. As we settle into the final stretch of this story, what becomes unmistakable is that the medieval world survived not because it eliminated danger, but because it absorbed it. Shock after shock tested its limits, and yet those limits shifted outward over time. Slowly, almost invisibly, capacity increased. One of the clearest long-term protections against extinction was scale. By the High Middle Ages, Eurasia and North Africa were tied together through expanding networks of trade, diplomacy, and migration. While these connections could transmit disease, as seen so devastatingly with plague, they also transmitted goods, technology, and ideas. Papermaking moved westward. Agricultural crops such as citrus fruits, rice varieties, and improved grains spread across climates. Navigational techniques improved maritime reliability. The more interconnected the medieval world became, the harder it was for any single regional catastrophe to erase civilization as a whole. Food security, fragile as it often was, became incrementally more diversified. Grain remained central, but legumes, root vegetables, orchard crops, and livestock products supplemented diets in different regions. Coastal communities leaned on fish, particularly preserved cod and herring, which became staples in northern Europe. In Mediterranean zones, olives and grapes provided alternative calorie sources. Diversity of diet did not eliminate famine, but it reduced absolute dependence on one crop. The wider the base, the less likely total failure became. Institutional continuity deepened as well. The medieval church, Islamic scholarly institutions, Chinese civil bureaucracy, and various imperial systems maintained administrative frameworks that outlived individual rulers. When political leadership faltered, institutional memory often persisted. Records were copied. Land boundaries were remembered. Legal traditions endured. Extinction requires not only demographic collapse but the erasure of organizational memory. Medieval institutions, though imperfect, preserved that memory across generations. There is also a subtle but important truth about demographic resilience. Human populations, when not constrained by resources, recover relatively quickly. After plague reduced numbers dramatically, birth rates often rose. Earlier marriage ages in some regions accelerated population regrowth. Land abundance relative to labor encouraged family formation. Recovery was uneven and sometimes slow, but it was steady. Medieval extinction would have required repeated mortality at a pace that prevented generational replacement. History shows severe waves, but not sustained annihilation. Environmental knowledge expanded gradually, often through trial and error. Flood-prone regions invested in embankments. Mountain communities refined terracing techniques. Irrigation systems were repaired and extended when political stability allowed. Even in times of fragmentation, local expertise endured. People knew which fields drained best, which crops resisted cold, which grazing lands recovered fastest after drought. This intimate environmental knowledge acted as localized insurance. Economic adaptation proved equally important. As coinage circulation increased and credit systems developed, merchants could absorb temporary losses more effectively. Banking families in Italy pioneered financial tools that spread risk across investors. Partnerships divided exposure. Insurance mechanisms, rudimentary by modern standards, emerged in maritime trade. These financial innovations did not protect peasants from crop failure directly, but they stabilized broader economic frameworks, making widespread collapse less likely. Culturally, medieval societies maintained a deep sense of continuity through ritual and shared identity. Even after catastrophic mortality, liturgical calendars continued. Festivals returned with the seasons. Guilds resumed their patron celebrations. The repetition of these communal rhythms reinforced social cohesion. Cohesion, in turn, supported rebuilding. Extinction at a civilizational scale would have required the unraveling of shared meaning. Instead, meaning persisted even if reshaped by suffering. It is important to acknowledge that certain regions did experience long-term decline. Some irrigation systems in parts of the Middle East deteriorated over centuries of political upheaval. Certain trade corridors diminished permanently. Marginal settlements were abandoned and never reoccupied. But these were contractions within a larger continuum, not total erasures. Civilization reorganized geographically rather than disappearing entirely. By the 15th century, the medieval world was on the cusp of transformation, not extinction. Maritime exploration would soon connect continents. Printing would accelerate knowledge transmission. Scientific inquiry would gradually reshape medicine and natural philosophy. These developments did not emerge from a civilization collapsing. They emerged from one that had survived repeated stress tests. So when we consider the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, through famine cycles, climate fluctuation, contaminated food, pest infestations, epidemic disease, warfare, and fragile logistics, we are really observing how thin the line between stability and collapse can be in pre-modern systems. Yet we are also observing how distributed resilience, cultural memory, economic diversification, and environmental adaptation can prevent that line from being crossed. The medieval world stood close to its limits for centuries, and still it endured. Extinction was possible. Collapse was visible. As we reach the final reflection on this subject, perhaps the most striking realization is how ordinary survival was in the medieval world. Not easy, not comfortable, but ordinary. Extinction was a possibility that hovered at the edge of experience. Yet daily life continued with remarkable persistence. Fields were plowed even after famine. Bells rang even after plague. Contracts were signed even after war. The continuity of routine itself became a defense against disappearance. What made medieval societies so vulnerable was not ignorance or passivity. It was the narrowness of their safety margins. Energy production depended on human and animal muscle. Medical care relied on observation and inherited theory. Communication moved slowly. Food production was tied to weather in ways that left little room for error. When multiple pressures aligned, climate cooling, crop disease, livestock mortality, epidemic spread, political fragmentation, the result could be demographic collapse on a terrifying scale. But what prevented extinction was the layered redundancy built into human systems, even at that early stage of development. Medieval civilization was not centralized in a way that allowed single points of failure to destroy everything at once. Power was dispersed among kingdoms, duchies, city-states, tribal confederations, religious authorities, and merchant leagues. That fragmentation caused conflict, certainly, but it also meant that collapse in one region did not automatically cascade everywhere. Diversity of governance created diversity of outcomes. Geography added another buffer. Europe alone contained multiple climate zones: Mediterranean, continental, maritime, highland. A failed harvest in the north might not mirror conditions in the south. Across Eurasia, the range was even broader. While plague traveled along trade routes, environmental stress was rarely synchronized across all territories simultaneously. This geographical variety reduced the likelihood of universal failure. Over time, institutional learning compounded resilience. Municipal governments introduced public health measures after repeated epidemics. Grain storage systems became more organized. Port cities refined quarantine procedures. Agricultural manuals circulated improved techniques. Financial innovations spread risk in commerce. Each improvement was incremental. No single reform eliminated vulnerability, but collectively, they strengthened the scaffolding of society. There is also a demographic truth that worked in humanity's favor. Even after catastrophic mortality events like the Black Death, a substantial portion of the population survived. These survivors retained skills, memory, and reproductive capacity. Land, temporarily abundant relative to labor, sometimes improved living conditions for the next generation. Higher wages, better diets, and more accessible land in certain regions encouraged recovery. Medieval extinction would have required not only high mortality, but a sustained inability to rebuild population structures. That never fully occurred. Cultural continuity was equally decisive. Language persisted. Religious frameworks endured. Legal traditions adapted but did not vanish. Educational institutions, monasteries, madrasas, early universities, preserved knowledge across upheaval. Even when manuscripts were lost, copying continued elsewhere. Cultural extinction requires silence across generations. Medieval societies, despite profound hardship, never fell silent everywhere at once. Environmental feedback loops sometimes aided recovery as well. When population declined, pressure on land eased. Forest regrowth stabilized soil in abandoned areas. Wildlife patterns adjusted. Overcultivated fields sometimes regained fertility after years of reduced use. These ecological resets were unintended but consequential. They allowed subsequent generations to re-engage land that had previously been strained to its limit. The medieval world also benefited from human mobility. Migration redistributed population pressure. Labor shortages attracted settlers. Frontier zones opened and closed depending on climate and security. This fluidity prevented demographic concentration from becoming irreversible collapse. When one region faltered, another absorbed movement. Extinction was avoided because people did not remain fixed in failing systems. By the late medieval period, the accumulation of adaptive practices had subtly widened the margin of survival. Trade was broader, administration more systematic, technology incrementally improved. Even without modern science, empirical observation shaped policy. Society was still vulnerable but less brittle than before. So when we reflect on the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really tracing the outline of fragile systems under repeated strain. Famine cycles, pest infestations, contaminated grain, river floods, epidemic disease, and political fragmentation all push societies toward demographic collapse. At times, the brink was alarmingly close. Yet extinction never claimed the whole. What prevailed was not invulnerability, but persistence. Not certainty, but adaptation. Medieval civilization endured because it was flexible, distributed, and capable of learning, even slowly, from crisis. And in that quiet endurance, Across centuries of narrow margins and recurring shock lies the deeper story. Humanity standing close to the edge, again and again, and choosing, through countless small acts, to continue. If we take one final, reflective step back, the medieval story becomes less about how close humanity came to extinction, and more about how humanity learned to live near the edge without falling over it. The Middle Ages were not uniquely cursed or uniquely fragile. They were simply a period in which the distance between survival and collapse was visible. Modern systems often conceal that distance behind technology and infrastructure. Medieval life exposed it plainly. The fragility began with energy. Medieval societies were powered almost entirely by renewable sources: human labor, animal traction, wind, and water. When livestock died in harsh winters or during disease outbreaks, the loss rippled outward. Fewer animals meant fewer plowed fields. Fewer plowed fields meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests weakened the labor force. This feedback loop illustrates how tightly interwoven systems were. There was no surplus energy reserve waiting to compensate. Survival required constant balance. Climate variability intensified that balance. The medieval warm period encouraged expansion into marginal lands. Forests were cleared. Settlements pushed into higher elevations and northern latitudes. Population growth followed. But when climate patterns shifted, cooler summers, wetter seasons, the same lands became liabilities. Fields that once yielded modest but reliable harvests failed repeatedly. Retreat became necessary. Entire rural communities contracted or vanished. This was not universal across Europe or Eurasia, but where it occurred, it demonstrated how closely human settlement tracked environmental stability. Disease, of course, amplified every other weakness. The Black Death remains the most dramatic example, but medieval societies faced recurring outbreaks of smaller epidemics as well. Malnutrition increased susceptibility. Urban density facilitated transmission. Without modern medicine, communities relied on isolation, prayer, and rudimentary sanitation. Mortality was staggering in certain waves, yet crucially it was not total. Survivors carried forward agricultural skills, artisanal crafts, administrative knowledge, and family structures. Population decline was catastrophic, but not absolute. Political fragmentation added another layer of risk. Feudal obligations could hinder coordinated response to famine. Warfare destroyed crops and displaced populations. Tax burdens during scarcity deepened hardship. But fragmentation also prevented synchronized collapse. Multiple centers of authority meant multiple approaches to crisis. Some rulers failed disastrously. Others implemented grain controls, reduced taxes, or facilitated imports. Variation itself was protective. Trade networks represented both vulnerability and resilience. Long-distance commerce carried pathogens across continents, yet it also moved food and resources into struggling regions. The Mediterranean connected North Africa, the Levant, and Europe. The Silk Road linked East Asia to the Middle East. Maritime routes in the Indian Ocean facilitated exchange across vast distances. While no system was immune to disruption, Their multiplicity meant that economic life did not depend on a single artery. Cultural systems reinforced continuity through memory. Chronicles recorded famines and floods. Sermons reflected on suffering and endurance. Guilds preserved trade standards across generations. Universities, emerging in the later medieval period, institutionalized scholarship. These structures ensured that knowledge was not erased when populations declined. Extinction requires a break in transmission. Medieval societies, though shaken repeatedly, preserved their intellectual and cultural inheritance. Demographic recovery after crisis also followed predictable patterns. With land abundant relative to labor, wages rose in certain regions. Diets improved temporarily. Marriage patterns shifted. Birth rates often increased. While recovery could take decades, the underlying biological capacity for regrowth remained intact. Human populations are resilient when space and resources allow. Medieval extinction would have required repeated shocks so severe that regrowth was impossible. History shows repeated blows but also repeated rebounds. Environmental recovery occasionally aided this rebound. Abandoned farmland allowed soil nutrients to regenerate. Forests returned in some areas, stabilizing landscapes. Reduced human pressure temporarily eased ecological strain. When populations began to rise again, they did so on land that had partially restored itself. This unintended reset acted as a natural buffer. By the late 15th century, the medieval world was not approaching extinction. It was evolving into something new. Maritime exploration expanded horizons. Financial systems matured. Printing began to accelerate knowledge distribution. The same civilization that had nearly fractured under famine and plague was poised for global transformation. So when we speak of the bizarre ways medieval people almost went extinct, we are really describing a civilization that lived perpetually close to systemic thresholds. Climate instability, agricultural dependency, disease, pestilence, war, and fragile logistics repeatedly tested its foundations. At times, the strain was overwhelming, yet extinction never prevailed. What endured was adaptability, distributed across villages, towns, trade networks, institutions, and families. Medieval survival was not heroic in spectacle. It was incremental. It was practical. It was built on shared labor, accumulated memory, and the quiet decision to rebuild after loss.